Father, the early church was commanded to say Caesar is Lord, and if they refused, they died. And today your church is persecuted in places like China, Sudan. If they profess faith in you and disobey their government, they die. You've protected us, each of us, so far. We have not been called to die for our faith, but we face daily temptations to compromise, to bow down to many false gods, money and power, celebrities, popularity with our friends. Help us to honor you in all that we do and say, and to faithfully serve as ambassadors for Christ, and to shine his light in this present darkness. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
All right, well, today we're picking up in Daniel chapter 3. You remember last week the king Nebuchadnezzar had commanded all the leaders in Babylonia to come together and to bow down and worship this golden statue that he had set up. And all but three did bow down, but three did not, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these Chaldean wise men went to inform the king. They hurried to bring an accusation against those three. And that's where we pick up our story today. Is these companions, these three friends of Daniel, refused to worship the image that the king had set up. So we're picking up in Daniel 3, and I'll read verse 13 through 18. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in a furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answering said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now if you are ready to fall down, when you hear the sound of the harp and pipe and lyre and trigon, harp and bagpipe, every kind of music, fall down and worship this image that I have made, that's all well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." So we know that Nebuchadnezzar was enraged. He flew into a frenzy because of the years of service that these three had offered. He gave them a second chance, gave them one more opportunity to bow down. And the king had seen in the previous chapter 2 that the God of the Hebrews is far superior to these false gods that the Babylonians worship. That was the interpretation of his dream. And when I say that God is superior, it's really no comparison. That's not strong enough. God is the perfect sovereign God in control of all. And these false gods are completely worthless. They have nothing. So it's not even a fair comparison of God versus anyone else. But over the past 20 years, this king has grown to feel arrogant. He's very prideful. He feels unbeatable. He feels like no one can touch him. And so he's boastfully standing up and asking them all to bow down and worship this way. And so we have the invasion of Jerusalem a couple of more times. We had the original capture where Daniel came in 605 BC. Then we have another conquest in Jerusalem, 597 BC. This is when Ezekiel was taken captive along with many others. And then finally, 586 BC. This is where Nebuchadnezzar goes and destroys the city of Jerusalem and also destroys the temple, the holy temple of God. So we think there's a connection here that this setting up of the golden image happens soon after he's returned from conquering Jerusalem and destroying the temple of God. And these Babylonians, the way they believed, kind of a superstitious belief, they felt like it was a contest between their gods and the gods of the people that they conquered. So they feel like our gods are better than your gods if we win a military victory. And that's behind this statue. Now, how could these three friends choose to react in this situation? I think if any of us are in their shoes, we might be tempted in a similar way. They might want to make some kind of a long defense. They might want to plead for mercy. trying anything that they can think of to avoid going to that fiery furnace. We know that Daniel was not there with them. It's just Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were the only ones present. If Daniel had been there, of course, he would have refused to bow down as well, but he was away for some reason. They knew what Daniel would do in that situation, but more importantly, they knew what God wanted them to do. They knew how God had called them to obey and not bow down to these false gods. And so God had given them the faith, the courage, integrity, everything that they needed to continue to obey God, even in the face of that death threat. Now, they could have seen it as some kind of an opportunity to get promoted. If they go ahead and do what the king says, maybe he will honor them and raise them to even higher position. But there's this temptation to escape the trial that's ahead of them. And being tempted is not a sin. We know that Jesus was tempted. But it's how we respond to that temptation. Are we going to continue to walk with God, or do we yield to a temptation? That's the question. They could have reasoned that God would need believers in positions of power, positions of leadership. Somehow, if they could avoid that fiery furnace, they could continue to serve God. They could continue to spread his message in that kingdom where it's desperately needed. So they could have said something like, doesn't the end justify the means? As long as we end up serving God, as long as we're still doing what God has put us here to do, does it really matter how we get there? Isn't it okay to lie, cheat, and steal in order to do right in the end? No. And so they're struggling with this. They understand that it's wrong. But surely we would be more valuable to God if we're still alive, if we survive this encounter. And besides, the king is not asking us to give up the worship of God forever. He just wants us to bow down one time. It's just one little compromise. That's all he's asking us to do. It's not a big deal. They could have said, we're under pressure. The king has this authority over everyone, and we're just following orders. Certainly God would understand Nebuchadnezzar is to blame here. God wouldn't blame us. It's really the king that's forcing everyone. And they could have looked back at how the king had treated them over the past 20 years. He's trained them well. He's fed them. He's provided for them. They've been well treated as far as the captives, all of the captives. And so, we're just showing our appreciation. This is just a way of saying thank you for what the king has done to us. And also, we still say today, when in Rome do as the Romans do, when in Babylon do as the Babylonians do, it's just a local custom. This is what these people do. We're not in Jerusalem anymore. And look around, you've got 300,000 leaders, the governors, the mayors, all the leaders from all of these different provinces in Babylonia. They're all bowing down. It must be okay, but everybody else is doing it. And we still hear that today in our culture when teenagers are trying to justify their behavior. Everyone else is doing it. It must not be bad. And besides, God will forgive us if we confess. That's safe. But no, these three friends did not fall into any of the traps that Satan tried to set. There were many different ways they could have tried to avoid the furnace, but they didn't go for any of it. They immediately understood the issue here is whether God is able to save. Is God able to deliver us from our trials or not? And that's the heart of it. And the first lesson we had, this goes back to November, but that very first lesson where I brought in the tripod and we were looking at the three legs, you've got God's sovereign control, the fact that God is completely in control over all things. God's wisdom, it's perfect, it's infinite. God knows all things. And then God's love for us, unfailing, perfect. He always desires what is best for us. And so because those three legs can never fail, that tripod stands sturdy. It's something that cannot collapse. And so because those things are true, we can trust God. And so that's what they did. They had full faith and confidence in God. There was no hint of doubt in what they were about to do. Their future was in God's hands. They understood that. And so without any hesitation, they admit their guilt. They say, these accusations are true. We did refuse to bow down, and we continue to refuse to bow down. They affirmed their faith in God. They submitted to God's will. And whatever anxiety they may have felt as they approached the fiery furnace, is replaced by the peace of God. And Philippians 4, 6, and 7 that I give you there, that's one of Chuck's favorite passages. It was in the most recent sermon. And so that's something that still applies to us today as we struggle in our temptations. Yeah. But the king at the end here asks what God will be able to deliver you. And he's forgotten what he just said, the end of chapter 2, verse 247. He made this comment about Daniel's God is able to reveal mysteries. He's the God of gods. He's the Lord of kings. It was clear to Nebuchadnezzar at that time, after the dream interpretation, that Daniel's God was the true God. But now he's forgotten. And these three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they realize the possibility that God may allow them to die in the furnace as martyrs. And sometimes God's purpose does require sacrifice. And we see that even in the stories from the early church in the New Testament, how Peter and Matthew and the others all go on as they were ambassadors, that were the beginning of the early church, spreading and planting churches. And in the end, they were crucified, they were died various ways. And that continues today, all Christian persecution down through history. Sometimes God's people do die, but they were prepared to die. And the point here is that some things are worth dying for. Some things are more important than our physical life. And one of those is who we serve. So I gave you Joshua 1:9 that talks about, don't fear, God will be with you wherever you go. And then Joshua 24:15, choose this day who you will serve. Are you going to serve false gods? As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. It's that commitment that these three had made. So the three friends are listed in the Hall of Faith, Hebrews chapter 11, where you have verses about Abraham and Noah and many others down through history. They're listed in 11:34 at the beginning of that verse as those who quenched the fire. That they gave themselves fully to God's will. They continued to be devoted to serve God and testify of God's power right up to the point they go into the furnace. And you have the situations like I give you Acts chapter 5, verse 29 through 33, where I believe these three continue to encourage even the New Testament believers and even us today. But that situation in Acts 5, you have Peter in a situation where Peter, along with other apostles, are facing death, going up against the religious leaders. And the point there is, are we going to obey God or are we going to obey men, government leadership? So Peter was in the same situation as these three facing death. But the faith of these three friends, they didn't just affirm God, they didn't just say we believe in God. They went to the point of saying, not my will, but thine be done. They were saying the same thing as Jesus in Gethsemane, and that's the Matthew 26:39, that Jesus was willing to die if that's the will of his Father. So he was obedient even unto death. And that was Philippians 2:8, which is another Chuck's favorite along with mine. So now we go to the back of our handout, and we're going to pick up in Daniel chapter 3, verse 19 through 23, where the three friends are cast into the fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury. The expression on his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. He ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these 3 men were bound in their cloaks and their tunics, their hats, their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. So the king was realized now that these 3 would never bow down, that they would never worship his golden image. And in Exodus chapter 20, this is the beginning of the 10 Commandments, but as God begins those, and he says, have no other gods before me. And so this is something that goes way back to the time of Moses. It was known for centuries, even before Daniel. The king likely wanted to pardon these 3. He wanted to figure out some way they wouldn't have to be burned, but he couldn't break his own law, so he's painted himself into a corner. He's made a law that he's not able to change. And so now he's frustrated, and the only thing he can do is carry out the sentence. And he orders this furnace heated 7 times hotter. Just imagine the tension during that time as the furnace is warming up more and more. All the other people, 300,000 people, still bowed down to the image, afraid to move. And those 3 are being taken up to the furnace. So you have the strong soldiers who bind the 3 Jews, and still their clothing is in place. Normally, before a criminal execution, they would remove the clothing, and that's just part of the humiliation of being executed that way, same in crucifixions. But this detail provides another testimony of God's power, because the clothes were not burned. And you know, if you take something like a piece of cotton fabric and toss it into a fire, how quickly it's consumed. But they come out, we'll see next time, there's no damage even to their clothing. And yet the flames are very real. People might say, well, something must have happened. The furnace, the fire went out. But no, it killed the soldiers. It just didn't kill the 3 friends. And God planned to save these 3. So this really comes to the key point in our lesson. Why did God allow them to go through that? Why did they have to go into the fiery furnace? Such a terrifying experience. And something that we cry out to God as we go through difficult trials in our life with illness or death of a loved one or whatever it may be that we're called to face. God wanted the Babylonians to learn something, and God wanted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to learn something from the experience of going through that trial and the deliverance that ultimately came. He could have rescued them before the fire, but he didn't. What he did was stand beside them and protect them through the trial, the fiery trial that they had to endure. And it's a picture, it's kind of a prophecy of what will happen in the end times as God protects the Jews. He will protect his people during that time of tribulation in the end, before the Antichrist is destroyed. And as believers today, we know how God provides protection. God gives us the courage. He gives us the grace. Whatever we need to endure those trials, and 1 Peter chapter 1 begins with that point. So now we move on to our last section. This is Daniel 3, verse 24 through 26, the miraculous deliverance as the 3 come out of the furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished. He rose up in haste. And I'll just comment there that that part about rising up. And the Aramaic word that's used there actually means terrified, just very afraid, very frightened, very alarmed. So if you want to think of it this way, it says that the king got up out of his throne like he'd been shot out of a cannon. It's that kind of an impact. Think about, you're sitting at home, you're in a chair reading a book, it's late at night, no one else is around, it's very quiet. And what you don't realize is there's someone standing right behind you with pots and pans. And they take those pots and pans and just bang them together right next to your ear, the way that you would come out of that chair from being suddenly startled that way. That's the picture. So the king declares to his counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? They answered and said to the king, it's true. And the king answered and said, but I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire. They're not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th man is like a son of the gods. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace, and he declared, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. So the king is astonished. It's just disbelief at what he's seen. He can't believe his eyes. He looks inside the fiery furnace, and he expects to see 3 dead men, but instead he sees 4 men alive. And they're calm. They're not screaming in agony. It's not what you would expect from people burning in a furnace. And he expected them to try to escape, to run out the door, or climb out somehow, but they're in no hurry. Why? Because it's cool in the furnace. And I know Kathy remembers this one. Some of you may remember as well. I started high school in 1972, and at that time our youth group, our youth choir, was doing some of these new musicals that just came out that year. And they were written by Burl Red. The first one was It's Cool in the Furnace, about this story. The next one was Celebrate Life. And you still sing a hymn from that one, in remembrance of me. We sing that at communion many times. And then Light Shine, that's another great musical from that period. So these are some of the most important, powerful stories in the Bible, and they're so helpful for young people to learn these lessons. But the king saw here the fourth man. He looks like a son of the gods in the NIV. And the way King James translates it, it says, the fourth man is like the Son of God, the Son of God. And many Bible scholars do believe that it was Jesus in the fiery furnace with them. But it's not likely that Nebuchadnezzar understands this completely. It's just that he can't explain it any other way to describe the appearance of the fourth man in the furnace. And I give you some other pictures here. These are visits from God, what they call theophanies. And Exodus 3:2 is the burning bush where God appears to Moses. Exodus 13:21 is the pillar of fire as they're wandering in the wilderness. Exodus 19:18 at Mount Sinai when Moses is about to receive the Ten Commandments, how God appears in the smoke. Mark 9:2 is the transfiguration of Jesus. And then Acts 2 verse 2, the wind of the Spirit coming at Pentecost and the flame. So even if it was an angel in the fiery furnace with those three men, clearly God has taken control. This was a one-world religious ceremony where the king was trying to get all of the leaders in the kingdom to bow down to his false image. And yet now God is completely in control. The king is trying to unify the empire around this worship of the statue, but instead God gets all the glory. So it's the opposite of what the king intended. Instead of the king getting glory, Daniel's God and the God of these three gets the glory. So Christ is with us in the same way. We know that the Son of God, we don't have to wonder if it's an angel. God himself is with us as we go through our difficult trials. And I gave you Hebrews 13 and Matthew 28, 1 Peter 4 in that case. But we know that Christ will never leave us or forsake us. He's with us always as we go through these things. Now, next week, we'll read what happened when those three came out of the furnace and how the people responded, including the king. You got 300,000 eyewitnesses. These were the leaders, the mayors and governors from all over. Impeccable eyewitnesses, all saw this. It's not just the king had in a delusion. And so these judges and all these leaders are going to witness what happened and then take that back to their communities, to their provinces as they go, because the king is going to send a decree to the entire empire, and that decree acknowledges the power of the true God. So we'll finish chapter 3 next time, and then we'll see that it's not only a true story, a historical event that happened to these three, but it's also a parable, and it's also a prophecy that still awaits fulfillment, even for us today. So I hope you'll be with us then.